Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Ekaterina, and I'm a methodologist in the Sky Corporate Department. And as you may see on your screens, we are going to discuss error correction today. And we are going to talk about different error correction techniques. We are going to discuss the question whether you need to correct all your students' mistakes or not. And of course, I hope that the video will be very effective and productive for you. You will learn some new information. You will use this information during your lessons, of course. And this information will help you to make more effective and productive lessons for your students. So let's get comfortable and begin. And I want us to begin with the question if we need to correct all the students' mistakes or no. Some people say that we do need to correct all the mistakes. Some people say that we don't. But I believe that we need to find a certain balance here. We don't need to ignore the mistakes and we don't need to correct every single one. Only because the mistakes sometimes cannot be mistakes, they can be slips, they can be out of your students' excitement. And if you go and correct every single mistake, it may lead to it may demotivate your student to speak. Your student will be shy. Your student won't be will not want to speak anymore, and yeah, it can be a problem. It can be a real problem. And we are going to talk about when and how we need to correct the mistakes. And but I would recommend you to ask your student at the first lesson whether your student wants to be corrected all the time or no, only because sometimes students expect their teacher to correct every single mistake, and when teacher doesn't correct the mistakes, your student feels ignored. Your student feels that your teacher is not involved in the process as much as he or she would want. So if you ask your student how and when he wants to be corrected, and your student, for example, says that, you know, I want you to correct me every time, you need to explain that it's not a very effective idea, it's not a very good idea, only because you will interrupt your student all the time and you will correct your student every mistake. And sometimes your student does not make a lot of mistakes, which is good, but you need to focus on certain mistakes, only because like this, your student will remember that this mistake has not to be made in the future. But if you correct a lot of random mistakes and the different techniques, your student won't remember it. Your student will make the same mistake again. So you need, of course, with every student, you need to choose a certain technique. How you want, how your student wants to be corrected, how you want to correct the student, what is the most effective way of mistakes correction with the student. And because some students remember this information in this way, some students understand and remember and work better when you present the material in this way. And of course, you need to be a very sensitive person here. You need to understand what your student wants, how your student learns better, and choose a certain way. Of course, you don't need to use one mistake correction technique all the time, but you can follow a certain pattern with each student. And to continue, I want you to look at the screens and see the quotation here. What you tell me, I forget. What I discover, I remember. And this quotation works well with the mistakes, of course. So if you're going to correct your student's mistake, you need to make sure that your student remembers this mistake and doesn't make it again. So it's a very good idea to not to correct your student mistakes yourself, but to give your student the chance to discover this mistake and to correct the mistake himself or herself. And how to do that, we will talk a bit later. And for now, I want us to focus on different techniques, different methods, how we can correct the mistakes. So who corrects? Who can correct the mistake? Of course, you can correct mistakes as the teacher. You can use different approaches that we will discuss a bit earlier. Of course, your student can correct the mistakes themselves. You may point, you may use some facial expression for your student, and your student understands that this is a mistake and corrects himself or herself. And it can be a peer correction if you are working in a group and one of the students speaks, another students are listening, and then you ask one of the students to correct their peers' mistakes. And I know that if we're working in Skyeng, only few of us really have groups, really work with groups. So this correction may be not very popular, peer correction, I mean, but if you're working in a group, peer correction is also a nice idea. You say that, for example, Anton, you're speaking, and Svetlana, please pay attention to what Anton is saying, and then you will correct his mistakes, and it works very well. Then you need to also remember the purpose of the mistakes correction and whether you work on fluency or accuracy. For example, if you are doing a grammar exercise, you just discovered some grammar construction, and then you're doing exercises, and you're working here on accuracy. You need your student to remember that this construction works this way. So you may correct your student mistakes. Here you work on accuracy. So when your student makes mistake, you help your student every time he makes this mistake, because you're working on accuracy. You want your student to remember certain construction very well. Or if you are doing speaking exercise, you're working on fluency. In this case, you're working on ability of your student to speak freely. So you don't want to interrupt your student. You don't want to interrupt your student every time he makes a mistake, because it will lead, as I said earlier, to discouragement. Your student won't be able to speak that freely anymore. And I would recommend the delayed correction here. So you listen, you write down the mistakes in the notes, and after your student finish talking, you correct the mistake. Of course, you give your student a very positive feedback. You say that, yes, well done, good job, but let's look at your mistakes. Mistakes correction is crucial at this point, but has to be a bit delayed. Doesn't have to be immediate correction, as in case when we are working on accuracy. Okay, so you can correct as a teacher. Your student can't correct themselves if you show them a special signal or sign or facial expression, or it can be a peer correction. And when you're working on accuracy, when you're doing exercise, grammar exercise, you need to correct immediately. Or if you're working on fluency, you need to use delayed correction. And let's move on, and let's look at the different techniques of mistakes correction. Okay, so here are 15 ways to correct the mistakes, and we will discuss the most important ones, the most frequently used ones. And the first is collect the errors for later. As I say, it's delayed correction. When your student is speaking and he makes a mistake, we don't need to correct him immediately. We use delayed correction. So we write the phrases or sentences with a mistake in the notes, and then we ask our student to correct. And sometimes when we write the sentence and we ask, so now correct the sentence, please, our student does not understand what exactly is the mistake and starts correcting the right part of the sentence, the right word in the sentence, the right construction. So to avoid this, we need to isolate the mistake. Okay, of course, you can highlight the word with a mistake, or you can underline it, or it's a very nice exercise. You can actually use the word in brackets. Put the word in brackets. So for example, your student says, he have breakfast every morning. And you write the same sentence, but have in brackets. And when your student correcting mistakes, you can ask your student open the brackets. And sometimes the mistakes stay with our students for a long time. And you tried everything, you tried every mistake correction techniques, it doesn't help. So we need to use drilling, and drilling actually helps when we ask your student to repeat the right sentence multiple times. And when your student, for example, always says he have breakfast, he have brother, he have a cat, she have, and so on, and it constantly the same mistake. So I know that this is quite frequent mistake. So I write he have breakfast every morning, have in brackets. Then I will write 3 or 4 more examples. And again, I will ask my student to open the brackets in all of them. And I will ask my student to read them aloud, maybe once, maybe twice. And I will do it every time he makes this mistake. So I will drill this mistake, and eventually my student will do better. Next one is facial expression. You can use eyebrows. You can use you can be angry, yeah, and show your student, no, this is a mistake. Or you can use a body language. You can use gestures. You can show your student like this, yeah, when your student needs to use past, but he says sentence in the present, or opposite like this in the future. Or you can, I don't know, show something like this again to your student to show that there is a mistake here. And when the student sees it, he thinks, aha, I made a mistake, so I need to correct it. Next one is repeat what you said. And when you're repeating what the student says, for example, your student again says he have breakfast every time, and you say, aha, he has breakfast every morning. And you emphasize and you put the stress on the word which your student has to correct. And usually the students like, ah, yeah, he has breakfast every morning. Or number 6, you can just say the right version. Yeah, you don't need to correct the student, use a facial expressions or gestures. You can just give your student, so for example, your student saying, I were at work yesterday, and you say, I was at work yesterday, right? And like this, you are just showing that the student that there is a mistake here, and ask your student to repeat every time. Ask your student to repeat after you, because if you leave it without repetition, your student won't remember it like 99% of times. Okay, so you can also use grammatical terminology to identify the mistake. So for example, if your student says, I were at work last weekend, you can say to be, verb to be. And then your student knows that there is a mistake in the verb and he needs to correct it. But of course, for this type of correction, your student needs to know all the grammatical terminology, not all, but the grammatical terminology that he will need to correct. Because if you say verb and your student does not know what verb means, so you will need to explain what verb means in the beginning. Or you can give the rule. You can ask your student to remember the rule, or you can give your rule yourself, but I would recommend you to ask your student to remember the rule. If your student says that I were at work yesterday, you can say, we use I was, and he, she was, they were, right? So then your student, oh yeah, that's right, and corrects himself. Or you can always ask when we use was and when we use were. Yeah, without saying it yourself, your student makes mistake and you say like, okay, good, but when we use were and when we use was. Yes. Okay, so then you can just say to your student that, no, you're wrong. No, this is a mistake here, but of course in a nice way. And ask your student to repeat. Always ask your student to repeat what he says. So if your student makes mistake, you say, no, try again. And your student tries again. He's like, no, maybe again. And then when your student says the word correctly, you say, yes, well done, good job. But if your student, of course, repeats the same mistake a lot of time, eventually he will remember this mistake. So maybe you don't want your student to repeat this phrase with mistake multiple times. Maybe 1-2 times is actually enough. Or you can also remind your student when you studied that point, yeah, that grammatical term or grammatical structure, or the word that he made mistake in. So when your student made the mistake, you can say like, yeah, remember what we talked about last lesson, or remember what we talked about a week ago? We talked about was and were. Yeah, and then your student, yeah, exactly, that's right. And then your student corrects the mistake. Okay, so these are the types of mistakes correction, and we can use all of them. But remember what you're working on. If you're working on accuracy, you're using immediate corrections like facial expression, body language, or repeating what your students said. But if we're working and focusing on fluency, we need to use delayed correction. And here is like we're collecting errors for later, and we can remind your student the point and grammatical structure that we studied. We can use grammatical terminology to identify the mistakes. So in these cases, we're using delayed correction. We are writing it in the notes, and we are correcting the mistakes after our student finished speaking. Okay, and before we finish, I'd like to summarize everything I said earlier. And first of all, we need to find the kind of a balance. We don't need to ignore all the mistakes our student makes, and we don't need to rush and correct every single one of them. The second one, you need to understand what you're working on. If you're working on accuracy, you're using immediate correction. If you're working on fluency, you're using delayed correction. So the types of delayed correction and immediate correction we discussed earlier, and I hope that you use different types of error corrections, so not to get bored, not to make your lessons boring, to surprise your student from time to time. And it's also good to try different techniques. So, dear colleagues, thank you very much for watching. As I said earlier, I hope that the video that you watched was useful and interesting for you. And if you have any questions, my name is Pechorina Ekaterina. You may find me in Skype or Slack, text me, and I will help you. Thank you very much for watching again. Have a good day.